we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to ask everybody to mute themselves right now so we can get through the opening and the introductions, and then the panelists will be able to speak. If we have time at the end for the questions, we'll try to open up mics so people can ask questions directly to the panelists there. So my name is Rich Clybourne. I'm the Executive Director of the Gundalow Company. I want to welcome you to the first of our 2022 Science Cafes, virtual Science Cafes. We've got a great lineup tonight, great subject. Can't wait to get started. So I'm just going to very quickly make a couple of announcements, and then I'll turn the things over to our program manager, Jess Orenberger. Announcements. For those of you that are Gundalow Company supporters, I just wanted to let you know that we finished our year very strong. Our annual appeal goal was at $60,000, and we finished the year with just, finished the appeal with just over 65,000. So if you were one of those contributors, we thank you very much. Those dollars go directly to our education programs and put us in a great position to start 2022. So thank you very much. I'm going to put a save the date out there for Saturday, the 4th of June. We have decided to undertake Riverfest one more time. So we'll be doing that on that Saturday. Similar format, we're going to have a small wooden boat show. We'll have vendors and partners, food, music. The only thing we're lacking this year is Round Island Regatta. The tides didn't work in our favor for that Saturday, so we're pushing Round Island out to August. So that's another date to save. We'll put that out as we get closer to the summer sailing season. And we're also going to start off with a gala on Friday evening. So information for that will come out shortly. And then lastly, I just want to put out a plea here. We are on the lookout for volunteers for 2022. I see a great mix out there of our volunteers and supporters. So it's great to see folks out here. Come sail with us on Piscataqua if you'd like to volunteer. It's a great way to get out on the water and meet a lot of people from the area and also people who are visiting. You can help us with camp. I'll let you know that our camps exploded this year. We have currently over 350 registered campers. We're going to wind up with close to 30 or a little over 30 different camp programs. And we're going to need help, folks. So if you'd like to help us with camp, think about becoming a volunteer there. We also have office needs, and I see several folks out there who help us out with those things, with mailings, postage, things of that nature. So that would be great to get volunteers to help with that as well. And then, of course, Riverfest in the planning and the day of participation, we really welcome as many volunteers as we can get for that. So if you're interested in becoming a volunteer, please send an email to info@gundalow.org, or you can email Jess Orenberger, our program manager, directly at education@gundalow.org. Both of those email addresses are on our website. So if you want go out there and check it out, you can certainly get those things. So I'm going to close my mouth now and turn things over to Jess so she can do the introductions. Jess, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Rich. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming and for presenters for volunteering their time to talk to us all about what they do. So our topic tonight is women on the water. And I'm just going to say a little bit about how our virtual cafes are going to work, and then we'll kind of dive right in. So for our virtual cafes, we are going to let our presenters speak for 5 to 10 minutes each. I believe some of our presenters are going to share their screens and share some images or videos about their daily life and things that they do. So we will let them go through all 3 of their presentations, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. If you would like to pop them in the chat, I can read them off, or if it's easier to unmute, you can try and raise your hand and we will scan through the screens and see if we can call on you, and you can unmute and ask your question live and in person. So that's how it's going to work. Let's get started. I will introduce our presenters and then we can get going. So our first presenter is Laura. Laura Brown is the owner and operator of Fox Point Oysters. I read her bio on her website, and she has a really interesting backstory in fine arts. So I'm excited to hear about the transition to how she got into oysters, in that ecological side of things. And then after Laura, we're going to move on to Brianna, and Brianna works for the New Hampshire Nature Conservancy as their marine program manager. And then after that, we will hear from Melissa Paley, who is the Conservation Law Foundation's Great Bay and Piscataqua waterkeeper. So 3 very interesting women who work on the water. All right, so Laura, you're up.
All right, let's just share this little presentation. Okay, everybody see it? We're good. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Laura Brown. I'm the owner and operator of Fox Point Oysters. I am super excited to be here to talk about my life as a woman on the water. I do spend a great deal of time out there, and I feel very, very lucky. And to be here with Brianna and Melissa, 2 very cool and accomplished women, is a huge bonus. So thank you so much for including me in this. It's quite an honor. Let me. Fox Point Oysters is the 2-acre oyster farm located in Little Bay, New Hampshire, just over near the Scammell Bridge in Durham, just off Cedar Point. I grow the eastern oyster and sell my products directly to consumers through wholesale retail outlets and at catered events and festivals in New Hampshire. I started the farm in 2012 with the help of my sister. This is her on the right and her in front of me in the kayak. Her name is Kristen Ward, and she's the owner of Choice Oysters. And she's also a marine biologist working out of UNH's Jackson Lab. She has been instrumental in Great Bay's oyster restoration programs, and her expertise helped me learn about oysters, and she really did help me start this farm. And to be clear, I am not a scientist. I might be one of the only farmers out there that does not have an aquaculture background. I lived and worked as a sculptor and a glass artist for many years before I changed careers and moved back here to New Hampshire, which is my original home state. Just a little about the area. Little Bay, for those of you who might not know, is located in the Great Bay estuary in southeast New Hampshire. The top skinny part of Great Bay, underneath the little blue dot there, on the left-hand image, that's Little Bay. And as we zoom in onto the right-hand side, you can see the light brown area. And that's where Fox Point Oyster sits, right on that giant mud flat near the Scammell Bridge. Little Bay has a unique mix of fresh water that comes from 5 major rivers, and a really nice salty blast from the tide from the Atlantic. Creates really good growing conditions for the oysters and a really good flavor. So this is the farm where I get to work pretty much every day from about April through December. I go out with the low tide and I come back in as the high tide starts coming in. In the spring, I purchased baby oysters from a hatchery in New England or from a local grower in New Hampshire. The oysters are placed in mesh bags where they're gently shaken and scrubbed of fouling like algae and sea squirts that make their home on the in-water gear. I do not feed the oysters. They eat naturally by filtering nutrients from the passing water. And the bags and cages just help keep the oysters organized and keep the predators away. When the oysters reach a certain size, they're placed in open mesh trays or directly on the bay floor where they're continually raked and sorted for harvest based on their quality and size. Most of the time in the farm is spent cleaning the gear and tumbling the oysters. Shaking and handling them helps them grow stronger, and they kind of knock around their shells, which helps break off the shells and sends all the strength into forming sort of a meatier oyster with a deeper cup. It takes about 2.5 to 3 years for the oysters to reach this sort of mature 3-inch harvest size up in the cold waters of New England here. So it really is a labor of love to get one little oyster to harvest. This is basically the farm almost every day. I totally love what I do. I feel very, very lucky. I get this gorgeous bay as my office. I experience all kinds of weather, and I get super fun people to come out there and help me from time to time. It is an extremely large amount of hard work. There are aches and pains daily, but I find it truly inspiring, and it has actually changed my life in many ways. Over time, I've become rather involved and much more aware of my farm's role in the New Hampshire food system. I'm proud to provide a locally raised healthy food to my directly to my local community. and the network of local food growers and promoters has become really important in my life. I now buy my food as local as possible, and I actually trade with my neighbor for meat. So keep it really close if I can. And I'm now turning my 1.25 acre homesteading into as many plants, vegetables, and fruits as I can possibly grow in a year. I sell most of my oysters directly to consumers from the parking lot near my farm. This was a COVID-related decision in 2020 after the restaurants and wholesalers couldn't move the product. But I noticed that it's really a great way to get to know my customers and see what their interests are and how they eat my product and enjoy the local food. It's been really nice. My farm and the time on the water has also brought more awareness of my environment in a huge way. I was always concerned with it, but as an artist, I was wasting a ton of materials. And now as a farmer, I notice every single thing I put down the drain it makes me more aware of what happens and where it goes out and how it's affecting the local environment. Oysters play a huge role in the ecosystem by filtering the water, and the cages used to grow the oysters provides habitat, hiding places, breeding spots, and feeding locations, just like a natural reef would for many species in the bay. And just as my farm has taught me a lot, I think it's important to share that knowledge. So I offer farm tours, which provides folks with a direct experience working and harvesting their oysters. And this is a great opportunity to share my farm and make people aware not only of where their food is grown, but how it impacts the environment directly. So that's just a small glimpse into what I do out on the water. I look forward to the upcoming discussion, and please feel free to contact me anytime. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Laura. That's awesome. That was really cool. I had no idea that was you on the bridge. I see that person all the time. That's cool. The more you know.
That's right.
All right. We're going to hand it over to Brianna now. So Brianna, go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Jess. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see that all right?
Yep.
All right. Sorry, just 1 second. Here we go. All right, yeah, so my name is Brianna Group. I'm the interim marine program manager for the Nature Conservancy in New Hampshire. A little bit of background about myself. So I'm originally from Maryland. I got my undergraduate degree from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County in biology and environmental science. And I actually worked in the solar agriculture field for about 2 years before I decided to go back to school. I went to grad school at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and there I focused, my master's thesis was on the native Olympia oyster out in Southern California. And I'd always had this love for the ocean and estuaries growing up near the Chesapeake. But it was really through that experience that I developed this passion for shellfish ecology and for aquaculture and restoration. And following graduation, I was lucky enough to get this job up here in New Hampshire as the oyster conservation coordinator for the Nature Conservancy. And I've loved being here ever since. So it's been about 4 years. I've been working for the New Hampshire chapter. And now I'm sitting as the interim marine program manager running our marine work here in Great Bay. So to talk a little bit about what I do, I just wanted to show a map. So this is the entire Great Bay estuary with all its tributaries. And then here you can see these pale green shapes are these are the native oyster reefs in the estuary. And then those orange boxes are the oyster restoration projects that the Nature Conservancy has completed in Great Bay. And we do all these oyster restoration projects in really close collaboration with the University of New Hampshire. So with Kristen Ward, Laura's sister, and then Ray Grizzle down at UNH. And so Great Bay has lost over 90% of our oyster reefs. And this is a big problem because oysters are really important animals for our estuarine ecosystems. They provide these really great benefits. Oysters create really important habitat for other lots of animals that live in the estuary. because of the way that they settle and grow on top of each other. They create all these really special little nooks and crannies for critters to hide in to escape predation, that then provide food for larger animals. And also, oysters improve our water quality by filtering out different nutrients and particulates from the system. So since we've lost most of our oysters, we've also lost these really important benefits that they provide. So the Nature Conservancy has been working to restore oysters to create this network of healthy, sustainable reefs so that we can bring back those two goals that I mentioned of creating that habitat and also improving our water quality. And we've been working with UNH really closely. We've restored within a 28.7 acre footprint since 2009. Most of my job is focused on oysters and this restoration work. So here on the right, you can see again, this is a different map showing all of our restoration projects with each of those red points signifying the location of a project that we've completed. And how we do this is first in late spring around June, we bring up truckloads of the seasoned surf clamshell from Rhode Island, and they go on this huge, massive barge that's taken out to the restoration site with a big crane, and that's that picture in the middle. And then all of that shell is moved into piles that then creates the reef foundation or the base of our restoration site. It's a really cool operation to see. It's massive. And then starting in July, we begin to grow oysters at the lab with Ray and Kristen. And how this happens is we get larvae shipped onto us, typically between like 8 and 12 million. It comes in a little FedEx package. It just kind of looks like a pile of dirt. They're microscopic. And then we work to settle that larvae on top of recycled oyster shells inside these settling tanks. And that picture on the right is a recycled oyster shell with tons of little baby spat or juvenile oysters growing on top of them. So about 75% of those oysters stay at the Jackson Lab on a floating raft where they continue to grow throughout the course of the summer. And then 25% of those oysters go to our oyster conservationist or community oyster gardening program. So how this program works is we have volunteers across the entire estuary, up all the tributaries and down the coastline that receive a cage of those baby oysters that they then care for over the course of the summer and collect data on about growth and survival. And then, so here's an example of one of the cages that our volunteers get. On the right is a picture of one of the kids from one of our volunteer sites measuring the oysters. And you can see here on the left from this map, we have volunteer sites across the entire estuary and up all the tributaries. So it's this really great community engagement program that reaches between 200 to 300 volunteers across the seacoast, really engaging people with the Great Bay Estuary and oysters and providing an opportunity to help with improving those oyster populations. And then at the end of the year, in like end of September, early October, we collect all those oysters back up and we deploy them on top of our reef restoration site. So here on the left, you can see fish totes filled with tons of those oysters, and each of those shells has tons of baby oysters growing on them. And then on the right, there's myself, Kristen Ward, and then our previous coastal marine director, Alex LaFerriere, shoveling the oysters off onto that reef base that we had built. So another really cool facet of our oyster conservation work that I'm especially really excited about is our growing partnership with our oyster growers, including Laura, for our restoration work moving forward. So with COVID and restaurants shutting down, the half-shell market was essentially halted, and this created a really negative impact on our aquaculture industries. And the Nature Conservancy received an anonymous donation to purchase oysters from our oyster growers across 7 states to then deploy them on top of reef restoration sites all over the 7 states. And here in New Hampshire, we were able to purchase oysters from all of our farmers, including a couple up in Maine, and to deploy them on our Nanny Island restoration site. And the really cool thing about deploying these adult oysters is that they're providing different benefits. So they're filtering at a really fast rate, they're reproducing, and also there's this disease resistance as well. So this was a really great program. It was a great win-win. We were able to deploy over 700,000 adult or ugly oysters onto 2 acres of our restoration site. And we finished up some monitoring this past fall, and it was really exciting because we haven't seen any recruitment, which is when you get baby oysters settling and growing onto the shells. We weren't seeing that over the past decade, or very little. And then after we put out these sore oysters a year later, we did see this massive spike in recruitment that we haven't seen in a decade, which is really exciting for what this method for restoration could mean. So these are just a couple other photos. On the right is Brian from Virgin Oyster Company and Stefan deploying oysters onto our restoration site through the SOAR program. And then Tim Henry from Bay Point also putting out some oysters. And then on the left was when Alex did some oyster deployments on a really frigid day in the winter. So alongside our oyster restoration work, we also had a chance this past year, which was really fun for me, to start working in eelgrass restoration, which is totally different than anything I've ever done. So it was a pretty steep learning curve, but we got to be partners on a working group that was piloting eelgrass restoration in the Great Bay Estuary last summer. And on the left, you can see that's where we were tying eelgrass shoots onto turfs that are then later planted at the sites. And on the right, there's Alex, myself, Melissa Paley, also from this call. And we were all, getting the shoots ready to be tied onto the turfs and for hand planting. So thank you so much. And I am looking forward to the discussion and any questions people might have. Great, I'm going to pass it off to Melissa.
Well, thank you, Brianna and Laura. It's really so much fun to be here at the Science Cafe, even if we're all in our little boxes instead of down there in the La Panza Lounge having beer and some actual oysters. But you do what you got to do. So I am Melissa Paley, and I'm the Great Bay Piscataqua Waterkeeper with the Conservation Law Foundation. And if folks don't know, CLF, Conservation Law, is a New England-wide environmental advocacy group that's been at the forefront of every significant environmental battle in New England for the past 50 years. And the battle that I get to wage as waterkeeper is to try to restore the health of the Great Bay Estuary, which is this marvelous network of rivers and bays here that make the seacoast the seacoast. And I sort of think that if we didn't have these rivers and bays, we could be in Topeka, Kansas. And I don't have anything against Topeka, Kansas, but it is these rivers and bays that make our region, this special place that we get to live and work and play. And it's a great privilege to be the advocate, to try to turn the tide on pollution here and bring this area back to health. And a big piece of how we do that is by supporting and encouraging oyster farmers like Laura and restoration efforts like what Brianna has spoken about, and that's all part of the plan. So but what I would like to do is share my screen and show you a short 4-minute video, because I kind of feel like it brings us back to this place that we're talking about. So with your indulgence here, I will share my screen and hope that everything goes as planned. So give me thumbs up, Jess, maybe if it looks okay. I'm Melissa Paley. I'm the waterkeeper for the Great Bay Piscataqua Estuary here in the beautiful coastal New Hampshire, southern Maine region. And it's really a privilege to be the advocate, to be the eyes, the ears, and the voice of the rivers and the bays here in the Seacoast region. because it's these rivers and this incredible landscape here that's the heart and soul of the Seacoast region. It's the lifeblood, it's our history, it's our identity, it's the basis of our economy. An estuary is a really special place where fresh water and salt water meet. And with tides that move in and out twice a day, you have a really unique ecosystem that's very special for fish and shellfish and wildlife and all kinds of other animals. The rivers that flow through into this Great Bay Estuary come from 52 communities, and they all meet in the Piscataqua River, which forms the boundary between New Hampshire and Maine. And then down along the long stretch of the Piscataqua out to Portsmouth and Newcastle and on to the Atlantic. It's a beautiful area. The only problem is if you look under the water, it's not so beautiful. And that's really the problem. We've had so much population growth, so much development of the land. We have parking lots and shopping malls and highways and homes and corporate business areas and all of these things, all that paved area, a lot of the runoff every time it rains comes into these rivers and bays, and that really creates a downward spiral. We've lost so much of the two cornerstone species that really make an estuary healthy. The underwater meadows of seagrasses, we've lost over 50% of those in the Great Bay Estuary. And the oysters that filter so much of the water in this bay, we've lost over 90% of them. Why does it matter if this place is clean? Well, estuaries are the basis of about 70% of the commercial fisheries in the Atlantic. All those fish and shellfish, they get their start in places like this. We have plants and animals and marine mammals, seals and others that live in this estuary. They need clean water. We have a lot of industries and farmers and oyster growers and beer brewers. All of those people know how important it is to have clean water. That's the basis of a lot of our economy here in the Seacoast region. What can you do to be part of the solution here? It's all about people power. We need people to get up at town meetings, in front of city councils, to write letters to the local papers, to pass bonds, to pass stronger laws, to use less fertilizers around your own house, to make sure your own septic system is functioning the way it should. Every day, I'm inspired by what I see around this estuary, people in communities, small communities and our cities, making investments in clean water, upgrading wastewater treatment plants, passing stronger laws to clean up the pollution that we dump into these rivers and bays so that this place isn't just beautiful, but it's healthy. Because that's really our responsibility, is to leave a place that's not just a pretty sunset or a pretty view and post on Instagram, but a place that's really healthy for future generations. So that's a little, brings you right out on the water, where I don't spend much time this time of the year. But the work of the waterkeeper doesn't really end when the boat comes out of the water. A lot of the work is in State House and town and city councils and in front of a computer, sadly. But we have a lot of really positive things going on in the Great Bay Estuary right now. And I think we're positioned to make a lot of important changes that we've spent the last 10 to 15 years fighting over. We're in sort of a new chapter now with municipalities that are really working together in a way that they haven't in the recent past. We've had a lot of investment, about $200 million invested in upgrades at wastewater treatment facilities in communities around the estuary. We have a new federal Clean Water Act permit that is going to reduce the amount of pollution that's coming into the estuary from stormwater every time it rains. All of that pollution that's running in, we're hoping to really drive down the pollutant load in stormwater. We've got some really exciting restoration work going on. The eelgrass restoration pilot project that we got going this summer, we're learning from. We've got oyster growers commercially and non-commercial, the work that TNC and UNH are doing. So I think we're poised in the estuary to really push hard over the next couple of years and see if we can really improve water quality before we begin to seriously experience the impacts of climate change, which we are already feeling here in the estuary with warming waters, more increasingly intense rain events, more prolonged droughts, storm surge, rising sea levels. These are changes that we are experiencing here in the estuary, and we really have, I feel like, a window of opportunity to make our estuary more resilient, more healthy, so that it's better able to withstand the kinds of changes that we know are coming down the pike. So that's the work of the Waterkeeper, and I'd love to open it up and take questions, have a conversation with Brianna and Laura, and hear what questions all of you have.
Great, thanks, guys. So if anybody has any questions, you can either put them into the chat. I see we already have one there, so I'll start with that one. Or you can turn on your video and raise your hand, and I will do my best to call on people as I see them. So I'll read our first question that went into the chat. So it's from Kathy, and she says, fantastic that there has been a significant growth in oyster farming in Great Bay. Is there a point that it turns negative, and what could the negatives be?
I can take a quick pass at that. We talk about this quite a bit. Currently, there's about 80 acres that are being farmed or are leased to be farmed. Not all of those 80 acres are covered with oysters. So like my 2-acre oyster farm, I might be using like a third of it. It's all spread out. So it's not like it's this packed jumbled space. Unless it's a low tide, you would never even know the oyster farm is there. So I'll just say that quickly. I think the short answer is no, there can't be too many oysters out there as far as water quality is concerned. I don't think that we could ever have enough farms out there to do what oysters do best, which is to filter the water. There is a lot of pushback from folks who own property on and around the water that don't want to see a commercial operation. A lot of times what's in their head is that it's just like giant boats going out making tons of noise. I go out on a kayak. Most people don't even know I'm out there. So there's a bit of confusion as to what's going to happen if there's an oyster farm near my property from a lot of people, and they want to make sure that they can still drive their boats wherever they want, jump in the water wherever they want, fish wherever they want, and that we won't be an interference. So that's the only reason that I can see that would be a negative for oyster farms out there. I say the more the merrier if they can find a spot. It's also very, very difficult to find an appropriate space for an oyster farm. We're not allowed in major channels. We're not just allowed to go out wherever we want. It's a very, very rigorous process to find a site.
Cool, great answer. Thank you.
I would just add to that before we experienced 2 different viruses that wiped out a large percentage of the oysters in the Great Bay estuary, we estimate that there were 25 million oysters in the estuary. And we currently have, Brianna, correct me if I'm wrong, but something around 2 million. So we've lost over 90% of the natural oyster reefs in the estuary. So we have a long, long way to get back to the point where we had 25 million oysters. And in those days, those 25 million oysters could filter the entire volume of the estuary every 4 days. So you had this massive sort of, natural filtration system going on, just a machine filtering water, keeping it clean. And so the loss of all those oysters due to disease was a huge blow to the estuary. And so that's what we're trying to sort of climb back out of that oyster drought.
Wow, that's crazy. All All right, I see Morgan's hand raised. Morgan, go ahead, ask your question. You can unmute. Oh, Morgan, you gotta unmute first. There you go.
Can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
I was really excited to hear about your eelgrass plantings. And I was wondering if someone could tell us a little bit more about that. I read some articles about the work they're doing in Australia, and they're actually weaving these little seedlings into jute or hemp, and then it slowly disintegrates. I was just wondering what you guys are using and what are your successes?
I can sort of field that, but I'd love Brianna to chime in too. We had a pilot project that we got underway this season. I see Chris Peter on the call too. He's been part of that down with the National Estuarine Research Reserve at Sandy Point. We harvested about 8,000 eelgrass shoots from 2 different locations in the estuary. And we transplanted those shoots at 5 different locations using a couple different planting methods. And we did that all in May and early June. And then we spent the summer monitoring those sites to see how they were doing. And unfortunately, our results were very disappointing. We had very little survival of those shoots. And each site had different apparent problems, which we're still trying to understand. Some sites had a lot of green crabs, an invasive species that just tears up the eelgrass and destroys it before it has a chance to root. At other sites, there was just such massive amounts of nuisance seaweeds and macroalgae floating around, just massive piles of these seaweeds that just settled on our restoration sites and made it impossible for those plants to grow because they need a lot of sunlight that gets down to the water. The seaweeds were really a big problem at some sites. And a few sites, we noticed that there were a lot of horseshoe crabs that weren't eating the plants, but horseshoe crabs just are like these little plows. And when they go through the site, they just tear up those plants. So we unfortunately had very poor survival at the 5 sites that we piloted this summer, but we're continuing to meet and plan for additional restoration work this coming season. And we're going to try a couple different planting methods and see if we can find something that works. I think that it's important to note that we still have water quality that is not optimum for eelgrass survival. And that's why we have to do this work to restore, to reduce pollution, to create conditions that are more suitable for eelgrass survival. But we're doing that work. And if we continue doing that work and water quality does improve, we want to be ready to jumpstart eelgrass survival and eelgrass to thrive in the estuary by scaling up these these methods that we're experimenting with right now. Eelgrass is a very difficult plant to restore. There are some successes in places like Tampa Bay, some in the Chesapeake, but those are in areas where there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done to restore water quality, and we're not quite there yet.
Well, thank you.
Great. Brianna, do you have anything to add, or that was pretty comprehensive?
Yeah, I think Melissa, you got it all.
Great. Thank you for your question, Morgan. I'm going to pop to the chat. Val asked, is there an oyster shell recycling program here? She said she thinks about it every time she eats oysters and winds up just composting the shells. If there is not an official program, can she drop them off at a boat and into the Great Bay, or is that bad?
I can take that one. So there is a shell recycling program through the Coastal Conservation Association. So if you check their website, they have the restaurants listed on their site for the different restaurants that they have volunteers that go to and pick up oyster shells that they then quarantine for about a year just to make sure that they're safe to put back in the estuary. So yeah, I wouldn't dump them into the bay off the boat. You just want to make sure there's no bacteria or anything that's going back in the bay. So, but then there's also at UNH a little trailer that is also collecting used oyster shells from just, residents. So you can dump like a bucket of shells off there too.
That's up at Adams Point, right? That
Yep.
one.
Mhm.
Cool. That's great to know. Thanks. Our next question comes from Cynthia, and she wants to know, can you compare how the oyster farming and restoration work is going in Great Bay versus other East Coast estuaries?
I can talk about the restoration side. So a lot of other estuaries on the East Coast have more of a substrate problem. So they're limiting in hard, kind of like a hard structure that the oysters can settle and grow on. So what that means is a lot of places like down in the Gulf or even in the Chesapeake, what they do is they spend more time adding shell out into the estuary in big piles, or they even try using alternative substrates. I think that they were smashing up like old toilets maybe off of Long Island and putting those out for oysters to grow and settle on. So they'll really grow on anything hard. I found them growing on cages, zip ties, sea squirts. But up here in Great Bay, we kind of have a two-pronged problem where we're limiting in substrate, but then we're also limiting in recruitment. So we don't know exactly what the problem is, but we need more live adult oysters in the estuary to keep reproducing and creating more live oysters. So that's why we add the juvenile spat on shell. And then hopefully we're going to keep working with our oyster growers to continue adding those larger adult oysters too.
Great. Laura, would you like to speak to the farming side of it? If you know,
In terms of restoration,
in terms of
that was the
like
question there, right?
the oyster farming.
Oh, farming and
farming and restoration. So if you know
yeah,
anything
so
about the farming side.
Sure. New Hampshire is absolutely baby, tiny, itty bitty in terms of when it started. I think it was, I want to say like 2006 or 7 or somewhere in there. A guy came in and said, hey, I want to start an oyster farm, and went and talked to Kristen and Ray and said, can you help me find a spot? And there hadn't really been commercial oyster farming for a long time. So he kind of started it up, and then a couple more started the next year and a couple more started. So I think in 2012, when I started my farm, I might've been like the 4th or 5th person out there. So just for New Hampshire, we are just baby in this industry. Most people don't even know we exist yet. And I think Maine has something like 160 aquaculture farms. We have 14 that are actively harvesting, and there might be a total of like 16 or 18 out there that haven't started harvesting yet. And I know one group just does it for themselves. They raise their own oysters and they eat them. And it's kind of sweet. So there is a huge chance for us to grow. In fact, we grew 774% last year. So it's an industry that is doing very well. And we are adding a lot to our local industry as well, as far as restaurants and shuckers and events and things like that. So it's going well, but there is also that image we showed you of the Great Bay estuary. Little Bay is at the top sort of, and Great Bay is in the bottom part. We're not even allowed in Great Bay. The amount of space we're limited to is what's the Route 16 bridge there? Divides the bay from the Piscataqua River. I'm drawing a blank. We're from there west, and then the Scammell Bridge, that's pretty much the top limit. And then we go down to Adams Point, and we can't really go much further than that. So that question before is, can there be too many farms? Right now, there's hardly any space left to have a farm. So our industry is going to be restricted in its growth, but we are definitely very small potatoes in the terms of East Coast, like Chesapeake Bay. I don't even know how many hundreds of farms are out there.
Wow, very cool. Is it possible to farm in Great Bay, or they're just not?
Right now,
isn't good space for
this actually lends itself, I think, to Hugh Evans' question, which is the next one about oysters filtering toxins from the water and how can it be safe to eat the oysters. This kind of all helps answer that question. And Melissa, I know you know more than I do on this, but from the farming point of view, right now, Department of Environmental Services, this one brilliant man and his team, he is in charge of the water quality for us. So the bay is not this filthy pit where oysters are just eating and munching toxins and disgusting things, and then we take them out and eat them. The water quality is good for oysters. We have certain measures that we have to be under to make sure that it is safe. And he helps determine where we're allowed to farm and what conditions our farms are approved under. So we are all conditionally approved for a different set of circumstances. So I'm on one side of the Scammell Bridge and I am fine and I can harvest all year long. The other side can't harvest in the summer. This has to do with water patterns, with tide patterns, with drop-off locations, culverts. They flow bacteria when it rains. Runoff from rain events, we call them, create major shutdowns. So this past year was a very rainy year and we were closed more than we were open. So when we get an event, water quality gets tested. They check for bypasses in all of the wastewater treatment plants up all the different rivers. And DES makes sure that those water conditions meet certain criteria before we're open for harvesting again. A lot of times you hear oysters are filtering out pollution to clean the water. What they're eating are microscopic plants and animals that would otherwise muddy the water. So these are things that are also very natural to an ecosystem. They're little tiny bits of phytoplankton or plankton. They're getting spawned, like say a seaweed spawns. You can't see it, it just looks like mud. If those oysters don't eat, which is creating proteins and minerals and vitamins within them, if they don't eat that and filter it, sunlight can't penetrate the water. And if there's no sunlight penetrating the water, things like eelgrass is never going to grow. So there's this beautiful things that oysters do that just kind of keep that motion happening in the water. They're eating, they're filtering, and their pseudofeces that they release that go back down onto the bay floor also creates a whole nother space for other different animals and species to come in and utilize that as well. So they're not necessarily drinking all these toxins and then we eat them. The water quality is good if we're harvesting. If we're not allowed to harvest, then I wouldn't go out and get an oyster. So I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Very
Melissa,
strict.
did you
Well, yeah,
want to
just
add anything?
2 points. One, I think one of the questions is about could we grow in Great Bay? And Laura has described how all of the aquaculture is in Little Bay. And there is a prohibition of commercial aquaculture in Great Bay because it's owned by the federal government. It's part of the Great Bay National Wildlife Refuge owned by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so the water is not controlled by the state the way Little Bay is. And so that's a problem, not because there isn't suitable habitat or places to grow oysters. And that's why TNC's oyster restoration work is happening in Great Bay. That's it's a science restoration project. It's not a commercial, oyster growing business. So that work can happen in Great Bay, but the oyster growers, the commercial growers, are limited to Little Bay, which kind of does constrain how much aquaculture we can see in the estuary. Unfortunately, maybe we can change that. We haven't given up. But the other point is about the pollution. One of the pollutants that we're very concerned about in the Great Bay Estuary is nitrogen, and nitrogen is an essential element that plants need to grow, which is why we put it on lawns to fertilize them and so on and so forth. But when you have too much nitrogen, it does become a pollutant. It's like too much dessert. A little bit is good and too much is really not healthy. And what we have in the estuary is way, way, way too much nitrogen. And when there's a lot of nitrogen, you get a proliferation of algae and seaweeds because they love all this fertilizer and they just go crazy. So that creates what we call eutrophication, this pollution problem that we deal with here in the estuary. But from an oyster grower's point of view, that's good stuff because the oysters eat those microscopic plants and use that to grow. So the oysters are pulling the nitrogen out of the water column, using it to grow, and then those oysters, at least the commercial ones, are leaving the estuary, taking all their nitrogen with them. So it is really a win-win.
Very cool. All right. I'm going to move on to our next question in the chat from Emily. It says, Laura said she didn't feed her oysters. How about other farmers? Do they feed them? Do they add any growth hormones or antibiotics or other things that might be concerning?
No, that's what makes it so great. We do nothing. It's all in the water and it's all just right there for them. It's a very passive system. And that's part of what I love about it.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Great. The next question is there a program for individuals to get an oystering or fishing license in the estuary?
You can get a recreational license through Fish and Game. It is limited. There's a website you can check to make sure the water's open for harvesting. I think it's limited to like Saturdays, usually during the growing season, which is usually like I think May through October. You're limited as to how much you can get, and it's tricky to find them out there right now. I get a lot of people complaining that they used to walk out on top of all the oyster shells when they were kids, and wasn't that awesome? And it's like, well, yeah, you ate them all. They're gone. So it's a big joke out there, but there's not a lot of places to find them very much anymore, but you can get a license. It's fairly inexpensive too, I think.
Great.
I think the native reefs that are open for recreational harvest are at Adams Point and over at Thompson's Point, right? Brianna?
Yeah, it's Adams Point, Woodman Point, and I think part of Nanny Island. But I will say though, there's now a 15-acre closure on a big part of the Nanny Island native reef, since that reef is in pretty poor shape, to try to give it a chance to try to come back with some extra help of adding some oysters around it nearby. But yeah, there is a closure now.
Great, thanks. All right, our next one is from Paula. And she asks, what kind of mitigation steps are being implemented to reduce the impact of climate change on the health of the estuary? Will these steps be effective in the event that there is a sudden, more catastrophic change in the climate?
Well, that's a really, really good question. There are definitely some mitigation efforts underway. A couple of ones that there's some effort to use what's called living shorelines to try to stabilize the edges of our estuary as sea level rises, instead of using concrete walls and riprap and stone and things like that, which basically just harden the surface and move the problem to wherever it's not hardened. Living shorelines use plants, like trying to recreate a salt marsh edge so that rising water is the force of the water, and the sediment settles into these living areas. And the more that we can create living shorelines, the more resilient our shorelines will be as sea level rises. We're really salt marshes and eelgrass restoration is a very important mitigation strategy to climate change. Again, these are ecosystems that provide all kinds of values, not just to habitat, but the carbon that is sequestered in salt marshes and in eelgrass beds is 4 or more times greater than the carbon that's soaked up in terrestrial forests. So the more that we can do to keep our marshes healthy, to restore salt marsh and eelgrass habitat, the more carbon we're able to keep in the biota instead of in the atmosphere. And then there's a lot of work going on in communities all around the estuary to deal with floods and big increases in high velocity rain events, to look at our culverts, whether they're really able to deal with the water that's trying to go through them, to replace culverts or to remove them. And I cannot help but take this opportunity to call out a really, really significant restoration project that will make the Oyster River and Durham more resilient to climate change, and that is to remove the Mill Pond Dam. And I know this is a controversy, and some of you may live in Durham and be attached to the history of the dam on the Oyster River, but that dam is creating very significant water quality problems, habitat problems. The migratory fish in our estuary cannot get up and down between the saltwater and the freshwater habitats they need in their life cycle. And if we remove that dam and restore the tidal function of the Oyster River and the Great Bay Estuary will be a healthier and more resilient ecosystem to some of these climate impacts that we're already experiencing. So removing these kinds of barriers and restoring natural function of a tidal system is a really important step toward becoming climate ready.
Can I just ask a follow-up to that? I'm wondering what you call a living edge was that would help. Is that something?
Living
Is that-
shoreline, I think, did you say?
Yeah,
Hard to hear
right.
you.
Is that something that's, are those private properties? Are you working then with the owners of the land, or how does that work?
I think there's a great living shoreline project at Wagon Hill Farm in Durham at the mouth of the Oyster River. There's some discussion about using trying to establish some living shoreline on North Mill Pond in Portsmouth. There's another living shoreline on Cuts Cove, which is also in Portsmouth as you're coming in on Market Street from the highway, and you look off to the left as you're approaching the Sheraton, if you kind of know where I mean. Off on the left, that's Cuts Cove, and there's been a living shoreline that some faculty from UNH and others have developed it in there, again, trying to keep that area healthier and more resilient to rising seas. So they're being used in a number of different places by municipalities and also some private residents. Actually, there's a former city councilor in Portsmouth who lives by Little Harbor, and he just established some living shoreline in front of his house. So it's pretty widely applicable.
Awesome, thank you.
Great. I think we maybe only have time for one more question. So I am going to go with the next one in the chat from Carol, and she asks, as green crabs are a great nuisance problem, is there anyone turning green crabs into an asset rather than a liability?
So there was someone who was trying to find a way to create like a market out of green crabs. So figuring out the timing of the molting and having like a soft shell green crab market. I'm not sure with COVID where that ended up falling. I know that there is a PhD student that's doing a ton of research on green crab life cycle patterns in the estuary and looking at diet too. That's going to give us a lot more information about them and their impacts on the estuary. But Melissa, Laura, do you know where that kind of fell, that work trying to create a market? Oh, you're muted, Melissa.
Melissa, you're muted, I think.
There is a tremendous amount of work going on in Maine and New Hampshire in trying to figure out how you turn this horrible, wretched, invasive into a marketable, anything marketable, you know that people will go after it and will solve our invasives problem. But they're a tough species, but fertilizer use, some use for food, for fishing, bait. There's quite a bit of research to try to figure this out, and if we can do that, we'll be in much better shape.
I don't want to add to that, but I know there's two other. Can I answer these questions really fast that are in there? I hate leaving.
Yeah, go for it.
The shutdown with COVID totally sucked. I usually sold 90% of my oysters to restaurants, wholesale, retail outlets, all of that kind of thing. COVID came, I had nowhere to sell them. So I sat on the side of the road with my truck and I said, oysters, like people would call me and I'd be like, yeah, just meet me at 5:15 when low tide's over, and I'd run in and ice them down and sell them. So then I set up a time, like I'll be here on Saturday from whatever to whatever. And I revamped the website, and people now order online. They drive by, throw them in the car, and off they go. So it actually, now I sell 90% of my oysters through retail, directly to the consumer. I get to meet everyone, and it's like super fantastic. So only good thing out of COVID, I'm not sure. Thank you to everyone that's come and bought oysters. And then Chris, none of my oysters are ugly. They are super cute. I love them all. Some of them just get a little misshapen, as we all do. So I don't think there are any ugly oysters out there. They're not even orphaned. I still take care of them just the same way. Good question.
Awesome. Great. So that is our time. Thank you guys all for coming to our talk. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I know I did. And thank you so much to our presenters, our panelists. You guys are awesome and a wealth of information. It was really great. I thought you answered all those questions spectacularly. I thought it was just a really great time. So thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for supporting the Gundalow Company in our Science Cafe series.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much
having us.
me.
Good night, all.
Thanks, everyone.
Round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.